Actually, thank you. Actually, before I get to the limits of liberalism, my lectures are lagging behind the titles for reasons too tedious to recount. I'll get on to Christianity foul, if you remember, I didn't get round to last time. So there'll first of all be Christianity foul, then anybody who wants to leave in disgust can do that. And then, but if they do, they'll miss the second bit of the show, which is the limits of liberalism, all right? The account of Christian faith that I gave last time is one that I take to be thoroughly scriptural, orthodox, and traditional, with nothing newfangled about it, and in no sense a sort of coterie-minded interpretation. Indeed, as you would have noticed, I'm sure a lot of it runs back at least as far as Thomas Aquinas. And I think that the account, right or wrong, I mean, if that's what Christianity is roughly about, or something like that, is for one thing a lot more realistic than the likes of Richard Dawkins. I mean, it takes the full measure, I think, of human perversity and depravity, in contrast to the extraordinarily Panglossian view of humanity of Dawkins's The God Delusion. At the same time, on the other hand, it's a good deal more audacious than the liberal humanists and the rationalists about how this dire condition is to be repaired. It's at once, as it were, on the one hand, immeasurably more gloomy in its view of the human species than the bien-pensant liberal intelligentsia. Only, I think, Freud or the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer can match its unremitting gloom, which I believe is no more than realism. Schopenhauer, possibly the most gloomy philosopher who ever lived, so utterly and remorselessly glum that he's unwittingly hilarious. I don't know why there's something funny about unremitting gloom, but there isn't. And certainly a good deal more cold-eyed than the callow upbeatness of much American ideology. This is another of my little liberal interventionisms, which tends, I think, to mistake a kind of hubristic can-doery for hope. They're very, very different things. This view believes that a good deal of human wickedness is, of course, historically caused and conditioned and can be changed, or at least ameliorated, by political action. But it also believes that it's wildly implausible, given the scale and persistence and tenacity of human wickedness, to think that this is all there is to the matter. At the same time, however, it's absurdly and outrageously more hopeful than liberal rationalism, as well as absurdly more gloomy, with its apparently unhinged belief, the apparently unhinged Christian belief, the demented Christian belief, you might even say, that not only is the salvation of the human species possible, but that, contrary to all we read in the newspapers or see on Fox television, it has in some sense already taken place. Not even the wildest utopian secularist would assert something as outrageous as that. A huge number of the charges that Ditchkins levels against actually existing religion, so to speak, seem to me, as I think I said last time, thoroughly justified, and he deserves, Ditchkins, both of them, deserves a great deal of credit for parading them so forcefully, whatever slight air of monomania might lurk around the edges. Indeed, it's hard to imagine, isn't it, how any polemic against, say, the clerical abuse of children or the religious degradation of women could be too severe or hyperbolic. Yet it's scarcely a novel point, is it, that for the most part, Ditchkins tends to hold forth on religion in truly shocking ignorance of many of its tenets, a situation I've compared elsewhere with the arrogance of one who regards himself as competent to pronounce on arcane questions of biology, having, on the strength of a passing acquaintance with the British Book of Birds, or if you like, the Book of British Birds. Some might claim that Ditchkins is speaking of religion as a social phenomenon, not of theology, which is fair enough, but how could you speak of, say, fascism as a social phenomenon without a reasonably accurate grasp of its doctrine? as Dennis Turner writes, it is indeed extraordinary how theologically stuck in their ways some atheists are. Indeed, Stephen Mulhall, the English philosopher, writes of the atheist's superstitious conception of God. Superstitious conception of God. An atheist who has more than a primitive, which is usually to say satanic, understanding of theology is, in my view, as rare as an American who hasn't been abducted by aliens. A great many secular intellectuals with a reasonably sophisticated sense of what goes on in many academic areas other than their own, tout an abysmally crude and infantile version of what theology has traditionally maintained, and are quite complacently happy to do so. They claim, for example, as Christian doctrines, very confidently, such flagrant falsehoods as the idea that God is some kind of super entity outside the universe, or that he created the world rather as a carpenter might fashion a chair, that faith in this God means above all and firstly subscribing to the proposition that he exists, what I called last time the Yeti view of faith, that there is a real me inside me called the soul, which is truly me, as the body isn't, and which a wrathful God may consign to hell if I'm not well behaved, that our utter dependency on this deity is what stops us thinking and acting for ourselves, that this God cares deeply about whether we're sinful or not, because if we are, he demands to be placated, and other such secularist fantasies. Daniel Dennett defines religion at the beginning of his rather dreary book, Breaking the Spell, rather unoriginal book, I think, as, I quote, social systems whose participants avow belief in a supernatural agent or agents whose approval is to be sought, unquote, which as far as Christianity goes is rather like beginning a history of the potato by defining it as a rare species of rattlesnake. With boring predictability, Dennett's God is a satanic God. When people like this are informed that none of these are orthodox Christian beliefs, they imagine that this means not that they never were, but that they've been hastily ditched in the modern age by a clutch of guitar-toting liberal revisionists. And indeed, it's logical enough, isn't it, that those who see religion as nothing but false consciousness should so often get its beliefs so wrong. I mean, so childishly wrong, since what profit is to be yielded by the patient inspection of a belief system which you hold to be as pernicious as it's foolish? Who is likely to launch a time-consuming investigation of what Kabbalists or occultists or Rosicrucians actually hold when there's still Proust and Clarissa to be read and the children to be put to bed? So it is that, as it were, it's logical in a certain sense that those who polemicize most ferociously against religion are often those least qualified to do so for the most luminously understandable of reasons, namely they don't think it's even worth getting to understand or that there's anything substantial there to understand or argue with. It's as though when it comes to religion, I mean that's to say the single most astonishingly powerful, pervasive, tenacious and enduring form of popular culture that history has ever witnessed, as well as in many respects, as Ditchkins is quite right to point out, one of the most obnoxious. When it comes to that, any shoddy old travesty will do. And this quite often from those who are most ebulliently on the side of the common people. In a similar way, when it comes to the political left, very often no blow is too low, no libel too crass, no slur too scabrous for certain of its opponents, among whom we're now forced to include the more bibulous half of Ditchkins. You were supposed to laugh at that, actually. But it doesn't matter. When it comes to God, liberal rationalists who are otherwise accustomed to enforcing fine discriminations are permitted, agreeably enough, quite often to be as sloppy and raucous as they please. In the face of so-called irrationalism, science leads to stridency with hardly a struggle. Like the so-called war on terror, such rationalism is then in danger of mimicking the very irrationalism, so-called, it confronts in the very act of seeking to resist it. Yet this straw targeting of Christianity is now drearily commonplace among academics and intellectuals. I say academics and intellectuals because in a certain sense I think intellectuals are the reverse of academics, the very opposite of academics, but that's another lecture I'll give you for a small fee in private if you ask me later on. That's to say, among those who wouldn't allow a first-year student to get away with the gross caricatures in which they themselves indulge with such reckless insouciance. Ditchens on theology is rather like someone who lays claim to the title of literary critic by asserting that there are some very nice bits in the novel and some scary bits as well, but it's all very sad in the end. However, it is, of course, most certainly Christianity and not liberal rationalism which is largely responsible for this intellectual indolence. For apart from the signal instance of Stalinism, it's hard to think of a historical movement which has more squalidly betrayed its own revolutionary origins. Christianity long ago, as we know, shifted from the side of the poor and dispossessed to that of the rich and aggressive. The liberal establishment really has nothing whatsoever to fear from it, and indeed a great deal to gain. For the most part, it's become the creed of the suburban well-to-do, as we know, not the astonishing promise offered to the riffraff and undercover anti-imperialist militants with whom Jesus himself hung out. These people's response to the Anoim, a biblical term which can be roughly translated into American English as loser, is by and large to flush them off the streets. This brand of piety is horrified by the sight of a female breast, but considerably less appalled by the obscene inequalities between rich and poor, not least rich and poor nations. It laments the death of a fetus, but is apparently undisturbed by the burning to death of children in Iraq or Afghanistan in the name of American global dominion. By and large, it worships a God fashioned blasphemously in its own image, a clean-shaven, short-haired, gun-toting, sexually obsessed God with a special regard for that ontologically privileged piece of the globe just south of Canada and just north of Mexico. Rather than the Yahweh who is homeless, faceless, stateless, and imageless, who prods his people out of their comfortable settlement into the trackless terrors of the desert, and who brusquely informs them that their burnt offerings stink in his nostrils. Far from refusing to conform to the powers of this world, Christianity, as we know, has become the nauseating cant of lying politicians, corrupt bankers, and fanatical neocons, as well as an immensely profitable industry in its own right. Probably no nation on earth has plucked from the New Testament such a farrago of superstitious nonsense than the United States, with its incurable talent for going over the top. Such religion is oily, sanctimonious, brutally oppressive, and vilely bigoted. Morality, in its eyes, is a matter of the bedroom rather than the boardroom. It regards negativity as a thought crime, views pessimism as unpatriotic, and imagines that being a Christian means maintaining a glazed grin, a substantial bank balance, and a mouthful of pious platitudes. It denounces terrorism, but excludes from its strictures such kidnapping, torturing, murdering outfits as the CIA. One CIA crime, by the way, which hasn't received the urgent attention it should, I think, was the agency's dissemination of a Russian translation of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland during the Cold War. Was this to demonstrate the virtues of free verse and free expression, or to demoralize the Soviets by unleashing the virus of nihilism among them? Ask Edgar Hoover. This faith of the Pharisees can't see that the only cure for terrorism, though it may be too late, but the only cure for terrorism is justice, or grasp, as I was saying last time, how much the hideous and polluted and disfigured thing on its own threshold, the roaring and raging fury at its gates, is, among other things, its own monstrous creation. It's unable to acknowledge this thing of darkness as its own, unable to find its own reflection in this distorted visage, which will be the essential condition of what Christianity has traditionally known as repentance. In the light of this catastrophic situation, the bellicose ravings of Ditchkins are, if anything, too muted. It is hard to avoid the feeling that a God as bright, resourceful, and imaginative as the one we might just possibly have couldn't have hit on some more agreeable way of saving the world than religion. I'm talking then about the distinction between what seems to me a scriptural and an ideological kind of Christian faith, and as far as that distinction goes, we just, I suppose, have to interminably argue it. And I suppose that part of that exercise is what Nietzsche, who held that churches were the tombs and sepulchres of God, called, in an allusion to Kierkegaard, saving Christianity from Christendom. It's not a project, I think, that holds out much hope of success. Any form of Christian faith which fails to constitute a scandal and affront to the political state is, in my view, effectively worthless. Yet, of course, it's from the standpoint of values rooted, among other places, in the Judeo-Christian heritage that we identify these failings in the church, just as liberal civilization is, as it were, its own immanent critique, as a culture which never ceases to castigate its own shortcomings by reference to its own commendably high standards. Even so, it might be objected, in what might be called the populist argument from the person in the pew, the account of Christian faith I've outlined is the product of an intellectual elite loftily removed from actually existing religion. And of course it's true that there's a gap between a sophisticated theological understanding or scholarly understanding of the Christian gospel and the faith of millions of men and women who have neither the leisure nor the education for such scholarly inquiries. Much the same gap, however, yawns between, say, Dawkins and your average believer in evolution. I mean, I come from a country where they do believe in evolution, actually. Or between Islamic theology and those deluded Islamic radicals, so-called, who know scarcely anything about their own Islamic theology, suicide bombers and the like. Many Western liberal agnostics, interestingly, are keen to point out that gap in the case of Islam, keen to point out the gap between, as it were, the theology of Islam, of a religion of compassion and justice, and the grotesque distortion of that by Islamic terrorists, but then by no means usually so keen to point to the gap between the gospel and actually existing Christianity. On the whole, they would prefer, rather more sloppily, to take actually existing Christianity as the norm. It's also true, of course, that a great many Christians have fallen prey to flagrantly ideological versions of the gospel. That's to say, versions of it which in one way or another play into the hands of what St. John ominously refers to as the powers of this world. As far as I can see, there is no support in Scripture for what I believe may still be the practice at the Mormons' Brigham Young University. I refrain from placing that last word in scare quotes, where certainly when I was lecturing there at a rather miserable time in my life, those students or faculty members who needed for medical reasons to grow beards were required to carry on their persons a so-called beard card. But perhaps I've overlooked some anti-shaving verse in Luke or Matthew or something. It's not in fact the case, however, that even given the inevitable gap, not only in terms of theology, but in terms of any academic discipline between the sophisticated understanding and the more popular one, but not the case even so, that this understanding of the gospel is confined to an intellectual elite. My own father, who left school at the age of 15 to work for almost the whole of his life in a factory, who probably never read a book in his life, as far as I know, would, I'm sure, have endorsed it as a good Roman Catholic. Similarly, those on the political left who regard socialism as more than a matter of just labour camps and mass murder and state tyranny are not simply a coterie who happened to be familiar with the intricacies of the Grundrisse. On the contrary, hundreds of thousands of rank-and-file men and women in the working class movement have rejected such a caricature, caricatures which in fact ironically often come from intellectual elites or coteries themselves for some more authentic interpretation of socialism. There's no reason, I think, to think anything different of the Christian movement. In any case, you don't settle the question of whether, say, the New Testament is on the side of the rich and powerful by appealing to what most people happen to believe, any more than you verify the second law of thermodynamics by popular acclaim. You simply have to argue the question on the basis of what evidence you have and what rational techniques you can summon. Those who dismiss what I would see as soundly based readings of the gospel because they're not always widely shared among Christians are rather like those who object to some soundly based doctrines of liberalism simply because a lot of ordinary men and women believe in electrocuting rapists and shipping immigrants back to where they came from. Does that then discredit the sound views of liberal rationalists, politically speaking, like Christopher Hitchens? I think not. But not all people believe in electrocuting rapists or shipping immigrants where they came from. People who say things, as they sometimes do back in England, like, it would be a funny world if we all thought the same, or it takes all kinds to make a world, a saying which Ludwig Wittgenstein, as a non-Englishman, of course, was very struck by and thought it was a most beautiful and kindly saying, Wittgenstein said. It takes all kinds to make a world. People who say that kind of thing may not be all that well versed in John Locke or John Stuart Mill, but that doesn't mean that they're fascist beasts either, or that their liberalism, which what those sentiments are, of course, is not genuine. Besides, if religion has so flagrantly failed to live up to its own founding principles, what about liberal rationalism? What of the middle-class liberal or Enlightenment lineages which Ditchkins so zealously champions? Have these not themselves been from time to time a little less than perfect in their fidelity to their own admirable doctrines? What of the violent suborning of freedom and democracy of liberal capitalist society, the generation of poverty and famine, the warfare of sublime proportions, the arming and championing of one odious tyrant after another? One wonders why many of those Western commentators like Martin Amis, who responded to Islamic terror with panic and hysteria, didn't find their liberal sensibilities quite so wounded by the crimes of their own civilization, or at least didn't speak out quite so vociferously about them. Why was it only after 9/11, I wonder, when they themselves were now for the first time potential victims of attack with no thin line of soldiers between them and the enemy, that their moral indignation broke cover so stridently? What human carnage terrorism has so far murderously wrought in the West is a pinprick compared to the frightful history of slaughter and oppression of the West itself, though admittedly we don't know what the future might hold in this respect as far as terrorism goes. But it's quite as probable, surely, that we shall be done in by our own internecine quarrels as that we shall be done for by the new narrative of terrorism. Those who belong to civilizations like our own, which have long harassed, undermined, and sometimes destroyed the way of life of others, but who have not been remarkable for their loud public protestations against the fact, are now clamoring loudly because their own way of life is for the first time under military assault, and under assault, ironically, partly on account of the way it has treated others. It's not an edifying spectacle. In any case, isn't it from right-wing Western ideology that so much radical Islamist ideology springs? Ditchkins and his ilk support, by and large, the political status quo with various degrees of reformist dissent. Indeed, Richard Dawkins' raucous assaults on religion, case of evangelical atheism, if ever there was one, are in marked contrast with the sedate North Oxfordism of his general political outlook. Dawkins dislikes what has flowed from Abraham for some excellent reasons, I think, but he also finds it repugnant, I think for much the same reasons that one can imagine him harbouring stoutly Anglo-Saxon objections to Lacan, situationism, Trotsky, Dadaism, the unconscious, Julia Kristeva, Irish republicanism, and allowing one's children to run naked around the garden smoking dope. Even so, it's perfectly proper and entirely self-consistent for a liberal like Dawkins, and I applaud him in this, to oppose neoliberalism. He's a stout and excellent critic of United States foreign policy, for example, just as one can be a fan of the New Testament but not of the Vatican. But he doesn't concede that in that case. He doesn't concede the contradiction in his own case, as it were, to his opponents. Ditchkins rightly upholds liberal values, while rightly rejecting quite a few aspects of actually existing liberalism. But he won't extend that position, and neither will his more bibulous half, Christopher Hitchens, to Christianity. Neither is in much of a position, then, to call the religious kettle black. Hitchens, we can confidently assume, doesn't recognize his beloved Jefferson in Guantanamo Bay, however pally he may be with some of the architects of that hellhole. It's just that neither of them engages in the same capacity to think both sides of the question simultaneously, which is by no means the same as being impeccably even-handed, when it comes to religion. It's here that the liberal rationalism, which motivates their hostility to religion, and in many cases rightly and excellently so, suddenly deserts them. The same discrepancy, of course, between principle and actuality goes, I hardly need say, for the political left, which has scarcely been a stranger in its own camp to the gap between noble ideas and their unsavoury incarnation. Marxism began, among other things, as a response to a Christian movement which had betrayed its own roots and ended up doing much the same thing. It's just, I think, that for the deepest understanding of how and why that happened, for the most historically based, wide-ranging, ethically fierce and materially based, founded account of how that happened to Marxism, one has to go to certain mainstream currents of Marxism to understand it. Liberal humanism just isn't radical enough for the purpose. In the same way, the disgusting betrayals of the Christian churches stand under the judgment of the gospel itself. The story of liberal enlightenment is one of an exhilarating emancipation which constitutes a legacy beyond price. Nobody was more tenaciously of this opinion than Karl Marx. You can tell a Marxist from a postmodernist in the Marxist's undying admiration for the middle class, which he remembers, of course, was in its heyday, the most revolutionary formation which history has ever witnessed, wiping the last trace of the ancien régime from the face of the earth, except for the Duke of Edinburgh. The values of that liberal enlightenment, of that bourgeois enlightenment, of which Marx was so enamoured and of which he quite rightly saw himself as the heir, without which he thought any socialism would perish, are to be defended. The values of that are surely to be defended both against the pretentious follies of postmodernism and in real life protected by all legitimate force, if necessary, from those high-minded, unenlightened fanatics who seek to blow the heads off small children in the name of Allah. Some on the political left, I think, scandalously have muted their criticism of such atrocities, of such Islamist atrocities, in their zeal to point the finger of blame at their own rulers, and should be brought to book, I think, for this hypocrisy. The Enlightenment stemmed, of course, in part at least from Christian values, but also saw actually existing religion as part of the barbarism and despotism that it was out to oppose. Even so, in a devastating irony, it inherits its brave campaign against superstition partly from Christianity itself, with its rejection of all false gods and prophets, all idols, fetishes, magic rituals, and powers of darkness in the name of human flesh and blood. It goes without saying that we owe to bourgeois enlightenment the civil liberties, freedom of thought, feminism, socialism, and many aspects of democracy and republicanism which we cherish most deeply. And with that, of course, Ditchkins would thoroughly agree. But he wouldn't agree with this, that at the same time, such enlightened liberal humanism has been the legitimating ideology, or at least a certain very dominant, not the only, but a very dominant legitimating ideology of a capitalist and imperialist history more steeped in blood than any other episode in history. This is what Ditchkins doesn't say about admirable liberal enlightenment. Only Marxism, to my knowledge, recounts the story of how these two contrasting narratives are secretly one. Reminds us both of the precious achievements of, say, Francis Bacon, and of the fact that he was a devout believer in torture. That liberal modernity means both contraception and Hiroshima, liberation movements and nuclear warfare. Some people think it Eurocentric to point out that Europe was the historical home of modernity, forgetful that this means, among other things, that it was the home of the Holocaust. The radical answer to the question of whether modernity, enlightenment, is progressive is surely an emphatic yes and no. No. Okay. One of the best reasons, in my view, for being a Marxist, apart from the agreeable exasperation it causes to people you don't like, is that no other body of doctrine of which I'm aware asserts that liberal enlightenment of the Ditchkins variety is at one and the same time a tale of an enthralling advance in human emancipation and one long, insupportable nightmare from which no doubt we are struggling to awaken. The latter tale, moreover, as the verso to the other's recto, that is to say, the two colliding histories, the two conflicting histories, structurally complicit, structurally cheek, but not just contingently cheek by jowl, not just a kind of conventional liberal will on the one hand and on the other hand, but actually sides of the same narrative. It's thus that being a Marxist allows one, as it were, to speak out of both sides of one's mouth simultaneously, yielding no comfort on the one hand to the elegiac gloom of those enemies of enlightenment, whether patrician or postmodern, for whom it would seem the invention of everything from combine harvesters and dental anesthetics to feminism and anti-colonial independence was a ghastly mistake, all part of some illusory narrative of progress, while on the other hand, refusing that progressivist euphoria of which Dawkins, a spiritual child of H.G. Wells and C.P. Snow, is so resplendent an example, for which, apart from the stubbornly lingering spot of barbarism here and there, history as a whole is steadily on the way up. If ever there was a pious myth and a piece of credulous superstition, it's the liberal rationalist belief that, a few hiccups apart, we're all steadily on our way to a far finer world. My ex-Prime Minister, who I believe will be among you fairly soon, is a shining example of that kind of credulous nonsense. This foolish triumphalism is, so to speak, a hangover from the heroic liberal heritage when the bourgeoisie had quite good reason to believe that, because it was historically and politically on the way up, but one now existing incongruously cheek by jowl with the cynicism, skepticism, or nihilism into which much of that honourable liberal lineage has now degenerated. Radicals are those who believe that things are extremely bad with us, but they could feasibly be much improved. Conservatives believe that things are pretty bad, but that's just the way the human animal is. And liberals believe that there's a little bit of good and bad in all of us. Now, Marxism has no quarrel with the mighty ideals of liberal enlightenment. It doesn't really have any ideals of its own other than this. It simply inquires, with a certain faux naivete, perhaps, why, whenever there's an attempt to realize these ideals, they tend by some inexorable logic to twist into their opposites, so that freedom for some becomes oppression for others, notional equality generates actual inequality, and so on. By what mechanisms does that happen is the persistent question that Marxism addresses to capitalism. Reason as a form of dominion has produced some of the very aspects of Western civilization to which Islamism, Islamic radicalism, is a pathological reaction. In this sense, civilization and barbarism, enlightenment and irrationalism are by no means the simple opposites they may appear. What was long ago named the dialectic of enlightenment is, you might say, a kind of a form of constructive doublethink, for which the traditional name is dialectical, I suppose, that Dawkins in particular, with his sanctimonious high Victorian faith in scientific progress, has apparently failed to grasp. I don't mean that there's no such thing as scientific progress, of course, or that there's no such thing as progress. Of course there's lots of progress. The more the merrier. But there's no such thing as progress with a very large capital P. And that's where, I think, ideologically speaking, Dawkins goes wrong. For liberal rationalism, by and large, civilization and barbarism, or the opposition between them, can increasingly be mapped now on a west-east axis. And I'll say more about this in my final lecture. This super-civilized brand of cultural supremacism, which would no doubt be much offended by mere common or garden racism, is now much in fashion in the West. Martin Amis speaks of Islamic society as, I quote, less evolved than the West at a time when the West is busy slaughtering hundreds of thousands of the members of that society. It's hard to get less evolved than that. One can also map the pair, civilization and barbarism, vitally on a temporal axis. First barbarism, then civilization. The synchrony of the two, on which Marxists like Walter Benjamin insist, the fact that human civilization, for Freud as well, is among other much finer things, a higher or sublimated form of barbarism in which the violence which originally wrested it from chaos has to be maintained, insiders and outsiders. That synchrony of the two is therefore disavowed. For radicals, barbarism of one kind or another has remained one of the secretly enabling conditions, or barely concealed underside, of that precious thing we call civilization, whether in the West or in the East, a barbaric underbelly which, with the help of George Bush and his neocon gangsters, has recently become rather less concealed and rather less ashamed, shamefaced. The narrative which Marxism in particular has to deliver is of how Western capitalist rationality perpetually breeds its own savage irrationalisms as a backlash, without the slightest need to resort to the input of Islamic outsiders and their like. Perhaps we should recall this fact before we begin piously prating of British or American values. It would, I think, do no harm to Ditchkins's comically intemperate philippic against religion, indeed it would considerably reinforce it, to approach the subject as the liberal rationalist he is, rather than the subject as he does to the kind of indiscriminate condemnation which is neither liberal nor rational. It would be greatly to the benefit of Ditchkins's moral integrity and intellectual honesty, I think, to intersperse his mildly monomaniac diatribes on the topic. We're speaking here of monotheism versus monomania, if you like, with the odd glancing allusion, I mean, even if he relegated it to some shy footnote, nestling beneath his text, to say, the work in alleviating human suffering, which Christianity and other faiths have carried out for centuries among the wretched of the earth, or its efforts in the cause of global peace, or the readiness that some religious types have shown to lay down their lives for others, or those clergy who have given their lives as martyrs, not least in Latin America, in the struggle against US-supported autocracies. Acknowledging all this wouldn't necessarily mean for Ditchkin sustaining a fatal wound in the ideology. Okay. Many Western liberals are, as I've said before, careful to distinguish their criticisms of so-called Islamism from criticisms of Islam itself. They're rarely so scrupulous, however, when it comes to home-based faiths like religion. It seems not to be the case that liberalism begins at home. I live in Ireland, and the Irish have been shamefully abused and exploited by the Roman Catholic Church in many tediously familiar ways. I won't go through them. But the way the Irish are perhaps least aware of the way they've been exploited by the Catholic Church is the fact that they've never really been offered a version of the Gospels which it took even the slightest effort to reject for any, half-decent, sensitive, civilized person. So like a lot of people, they've been able to buy their atheism or agnosticism on the cheap. And this is a form of deprivation against which one ought properly, I think, to protest, even if it's a more subtle and less important form of deprivation than being locked up for life by psychopathically sadistic nuns for having born a child out of wedlock. The Catholic Church is in such understandably and justifiably bad odour in Ireland today that people these days sometimes cross the street when they catch sight of a priest approaching. In the old days, it used to be a landlord. Yet, the cruelties and stupidities which the Irish Church has perpetrated don't prevent me from recalling how, without it, generations of my own ancestors in Ireland would have gone unschooled, unnursed, unconsoled, and unburied. One of my own forebears in late 19th century Ireland, Father Mark Eagleton, got into hot water with his bishop for denouncing the local landlord from the pulpit. I suppose that Dawkins wouldn't take kindly to the case that acquired political characteristics can be genetically transmissible, but this does seem to be somewhat of an example of it. Let's see how we're doing now. Okay, I'll try to finish off and I'll leave out some rather boring stuff. It's curious, isn't it, how avatars of liberal enlightenment like Hitchens, Dawkins, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, and Ian McEwan have much less to say these days about the evils of global capitalism as opposed to the evils of radical Islam. Indeed, many of them hardly mention the word capitalism at all. One doesn't hear them speaking out in loud concert against, for example, the hideous American-backed regimes in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, as they did about Saddam Hussein once the hunt for reprisals for 9/11 was on. It's a familiar fact, though apparently not all that familiar to the US media, that 30 years to the day before the attack on the Twin Towers, the United States government violently overthrew the democratically elected government of Chile, installing in its place an odious puppet autocrat who went on to massacre far more people than died in the World Trade Center. The United States also, of course, supported for many years a regime in Indonesia which probably murdered more people than Saddam Hussein, but they didn't need their oil. There's reason to believe that Islamic terrorism is, among other causes, I don't think it's reduced to this, among other causes, a reaction to this imperial history, which is not to claim that there will be no fanatical Islamists around without Western imperialism, just as there would be doubtless fanatical Christian evangelicals, rather that, for example, without that vast concentration camp known as the Gaza Strip, it is not out of the question that the Twin Towers would still be standing. Those, like the novelist Martin Amis, who resent the ascription of even this much rationality to an Islamism which they prefer to see simply as psychopathological, should have a word, I think, with those in the British intelligence services, whose task it was some years ago to monitor the Irish Republican Army. These professional anti-terrorists knew enough not to swallow a lot of stupid tabloid hysteria about terrorists as monsters and mad beasts. They were well aware, British intelligence was well aware and is well aware, that the IRA's behaviour, however sometimes murderous, was, in a narrow sense of the word, rational, and that without acknowledging this fact, they would be incapable ever of defeating it. That was not in doubt in the inner corridors of the British government. The CIA, as I said before, with its record of kidnapping, torturing and murdering, its support for death squads and suborning of democracy, certainly qualifies, in my view, as a terrorist organisation, yet this doesn't mean for a moment that its agents are in the least irrational. Far from it. The other side of pathologizing one's enemy is exculpating oneself. I will, however, stop there, short as before, I'm afraid, and just to leave time for discussion if you'd like to raise any points.